This chapter covers health and psychological disorders. Most of your chapter only covers psychological disorders. However, we are also going to discuss health in this lecture, which is put at the beginning to set you up to be able to understand the psychological disorders. So when we talk about health, what we're talking about is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not just the absence of disease or infirmity. So from a Western point of view, health is often conceptualized in what we call the biomedical model. And what this means is health is seen in terms of disease. So disease in turn is then seen as originating from a specific and identifiable cause within or arriving from outside the body. Now, views from other cultures regard health more as an imbalance between negative and positive forces. So think of yin and yang. They also think of elemental ingredients, waste products from food. It might be based on humoral theory, or where illness arises from excess or deficiencies. Now, one major effort of health is disease prevention. And this has been an emphasis on reducing risks or identifying risk factors. So with this disease prevention, we're thinking along the lines of underweight and overweight, unsafe sex, high blood pressure, tobacco and alcohol consumption, unsafe water, sanitation and hygiene, iron deficiency, indoor smoke from solid fuels, high cholesterol, obesity, things that we actually can prevent or put into place ways to prevent it, or at least identify things that are going to cause a disease. And what happens is a lot of these risks that were identified here account for more than a third of all of the deaths worldwide. One of the things we have to look at when we are looking at any type of health is we have to look at disease versus illness, because they are two technically separate things. So with disease, this is going to be a malfunctioning, a maladaptation of a biologic or a psychophysiological process in the individual, where illness is more of a personal, interpersonal, cultural reaction to a disease or a discomfort. So let's think about an illness and a disease. So we tend to use those interchangeably. So a disease is, let's go with, so I'm going to use the example of lupus. So lupus is a disease. However, a lot of times lupus stays in remission in the body. When it comes out, you start to have an illness where you have those personal reactions, interpersonal reactions, cultural reactions. You start to get discomfort, disease. It leads to some type of illness, in the case of lupus, called a flare. So that's why the two can be a little bit different. Now, one of the other things is sickness. And a lot of times, again, all three are used interchangeably, but a lot of times sickness is also considered something completely different. And so what they consider sickness to be is almost society's way of making sense and dealing with the individual perception of the malfunctioning or the illness, and then the underlying pathology or the disease. So it's basically when both come together. So think of sickness as being illness plus disease. Disease is going to be more biomedical, while illness is going to be more cultural, more sociological, or even more psychological. Furthermore, disease is going to revolve around a malfunctioning or an adaptation of a biological or psychological process within an individual. So we have to really look at that, because I've stated that twice now. It's going to revolve around that malfunctioning of both. And that's why we call mental health disorders, they used to be mental health diseases, they used to be mental health illnesses. Now they're considered a disorder because technically they are both. So they would fall under the category of sickness. Now, illness is going to be more culturally determined because this is going to have to do with how a person actually reacts to the disease itself, how they handle it, and how it's looked at inside of a society. Now, the entire society is what is going to then deem a disease as a problem or a malfunction. It's also going to deem how people react to a disease. So society is definitely going to play a role in that. And we could see that at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. If you think back to when COVID-19 first came about, and it came about in China, over here in the United States, we didn't really tend to worry about it too much. As a society, we didn't deem it as a problem or a malfunction. We didn't really react to the disease. Even when the first couple of cases came over here, I believe there was one in Chicago that came through O'Hare and one in the Pacific Northwest, Seattle-ish. We still didn't think of it as a problem. It wasn't until basically society or lawmakers, people we looked up to, the news, all of those things started deeming it a problem that our society went, okay, wait, we have to really look at this. So that's when people started reacting. In terms of disease, illness, sickness, there are 3 different models we're going to look at. Now, Western culture is always dominated by a biomedical model, which will be the first one we look at. But you have to remember there are different models throughout different cultures and countries. So the first is the biomedical model. Now, the biomedical model, what this is it's a model of health that's going to view disease as a result from a specific identifiable cause, such as a pathogen. So think of a virus or a bacteria. A genetic or developmental abnormality, so think about being born with some type of mutated gene. A physical insult, so think about being exposed to a carcinogen or a cancer-producing agent. It's going to focus more on disease than it is on illness, and it's going to treat addiction as a disease, which is very, very controversial because of the fact that when we talk about addiction, we're not necessarily talking about a disease. We're not necessarily talking about an illness. We're talking about both, which is why it becomes controversial. The other thing is when we talk about mental health disorders, a lot of times we can put it towards a specific thing, meaning it is a genetic issue. It could also be a physical insult. You were exposed to something in the environment. But a lot of times we don't have a cause. And if we don't have a cause, it can't follow the biomedical model. And if it can't follow the biomedical model, then it doesn't fall under a disease. And so again, that's another reason why it becomes controversial. Now, with the biomedical model, it is very symptom driven. So there is an idea that there's a specific identifiable cause. So a pathogen, a genetic code, a developmental anomaly, something that's going to create some kind of physical damage inside of a person that we can see. And lastly, this is the traditional standard model. This is the model that we see in the United States and in a lot of Western world countries. The second model, which is kind of becoming a little more used in other areas, is the biopsychosocial model. And this is a model of health that views disease as kind of resulting from biological, psychological, and social factors. So it's taking all 3 and putting it together. It was originally designed in 1977 by Engel, and it was an alternative to that biomedical model, and it was bringing in some of those psychological factors and then obviously all of those social factors. It was looking at beyond the physical symptoms. What is going on psychologically? What are sociological factors are there? Because think about psychology. Think about psychological factors. They absolutely affect our physical symptoms. So think about anxiety, for example. So we have anxiety. Anxiety can result in numerous physical symptoms, right? It can result in fast heart rate, nausea, stomach aches, sweating, shaking, trembling. Some people get numb fingers, headaches, increased heart rate. All of these things are physical symptoms that the psychological basically starts. Now, after the biopsychosocial model came out, there were obviously criticisms against it. What these criticisms was that it places a heavier focus on the biological symptoms, very similar to the biomedical model. And it didn't focus enough on the psychological or the sociological to have a real impact, basically. Now, the model is still basically biological, and it's just now kind of touching on the psychological effects of the person. People are not really integrating the three aspects. Instead, they're looking at all three through a different lens, as opposed to putting them all together. The last model is what we call the Frankl Model. And the Frankl Model is very holistic. It's a mix between an endogenic, so using the genetic and the biological problems, the psychogenic, so the psychological processes, how people develop problems through their upbringing, the sociogenic, which are the social stressors, so think of problems in a stressful environment, and the noogenic, which is the spiritual level of a human being, so our philosophical realm of meaning. Now, Frankl was a psychiatrist, but he was also trained in psychoanalysis and philosophy, which is where he came up with this mix. Now, with these models, they move from less holistic to more holistic. So the biomedical model is going to be the least holistic. Then the biopsychosocial model will be in the middle. And then Frankl's model will be the most holistic. And when we are mentioning holistics, what we're talking about is a view that focuses on the interconnections between an individual, the interconnections between their relationships, their environment, their spiritual world. Now, all of these models lead to what we call health behavior. And with health behavior, we have to bring cultural factors into account because they play a very important role in our health in general, not just our mental health. Now, with that, we have the health promotion, we have disease prevention, which was mentioned, and a lot of times these are often used together. However, disease prevention tends to be concerned first and foremost with reducing the burden of a chronic disease and infectious diseases by preventing their development in the first place. Health promotion is going to be more concerned with how an individual's choice may enhance their health by providing sustaining healthy living through policies at both the societal level and in private sectors. Now, thinking about both of these, in theory, health promotion would automatically lead to disease prevention, but not everybody thinks that way. So, even though we use them together, they mean two different things. When we're looking at any kind of health promotion, disease prevention, one of the things we have to bring up is poverty, hunger, and malnutrition. So we talk a lot in the United States about obesity, but what we don't talk about is the other end of the spectrum. So when we talk about poverty, poverty is usually associated with inadequate food, and hunger is actually the most extreme form of poverty, where individuals are not able to actually meet the basic needs of food. Now, other than starvation and famine, which affect billions of the world population, famished individuals have to battle chronic undernourishment as well as micronutrient deficiencies. And all of these result in stunted growth, poor cognitive development, a negative cascading effect on school failure, and then heightened vulnerability to diseases and infections. So we look usually at how obesity affects diseases and infections. But one of the things we have to look at is the opposite end of the spectrum, because this affects billions of the world population. And these problems are particularly prevalent in low-income countries. It's been said that about 40%, and it's actually closer to 50% since I did these slides last year. So closer to 50% now of the world's population are presently suffering from either hunger or obesity, with about equal proportion in the two categories. So if you take everybody in the world, you can divide them in half, and half are going to have some kind of issue in terms of hunger, obesity, while the other half might be normal. And that's absolutely insane to think about, especially with the vulnerability to the diseases and the infections that we see on both ends of the spectrum. Some other things we have to look at in terms of health, we have to look at indicators of the relative health of particular cultures. So one of these things is life expectancy. So when we talk about life expectancy, again, we think about life expectancy in terms of the United States. We don't think about life expectancy in terms of the world. And when we mention life expectancy, this is the average number of years a person is expected to live from birth. We also have infant mortality. Infant mortality is the number of infant deaths, so 1 year of age or younger per 1,000 live births. And then subjective well-being. This is a person's perceptions and their self-judgments of his or her health and well-being that includes feelings of happiness as well as life satisfaction. So these are three things we really have to look at when we're looking at the health of a particular culture. So let's start with life expectancy. Now, with life expectancy, wealthier countries with more resources obviously have access to better nutrition, healthcare, more advanced technology. Therefore, they usually live longer. Now, U.S. life expectancy is more than third world countries, but it's definitely not the highest life expectancy in the world. And then sometimes the affluence of the country can actually backfire, and it then creates problems, which is why the U.S. is not the highest life expectancy in the world. And so an example of this is you can create fast food. This lowers life expectancy. So right now our life expectancy is somewhere around 73.2 years for the globe. But if we start to look at countries, Hong Kong and Japan are the two highest. Both of them have a life expectancy of about 85. So 12 years over that of our life expectancy of the globe. Now, the United States, that falls around 46, so the 46th highest country. There are countries above us that are definitely fall in more like in developing countries. and they're still above the United States, which is why we're not the highest life expectancy in the world. Our life expectancy is around about 79 years, but it goes all the way down to the lowest life expectancies are Central African Republic, Chad, Lesotho, Nigeria, Sierra Leone. All of these countries in Africa, they have an average life expectancy about 55. So almost 20 years below the average life expectancy for the globe. So that shows the difference between the developing countries and the developed countries, even with the affluence problems that can be created. Now, when we look at infant and child mortality rates, this is something, again, we have to look at in terms of looking at the relative health of a culture. So out of 224 countries, Afghanistan has the highest infant mortality rate. So about 117 infant deaths per 1,000. Norway, Japan, and Monaco are the lowest. The US is ranked 169th. So 224 countries. The US is 169th. We're not even in the top 100. Now, we only have 6 infant deaths per 1,000. But if that puts us at 169th, there's obviously ways we can improve so that we don't have 6 infant deaths per 100 or per 1,000. In 2002, our global infant mortality rate was 56 per 1,000 births, meaning as a whole. So obviously, we are much lower than that. Afghanistan being the highest is much higher than that. And our rate ranged from 3 to 165 deaths per 1,000. And at that point in time, the highest rates were actually in sub-Saharan Africa, very similar to the life expectancy. Now, they are still some of the lowest, but Afghanistan has taken over. Now, globally, an estimated 7.5 million children die annually during their first year of life. And then there's not just infant mortality, but there's also child mortality, which refers to the first 5 years of life. And that's currently estimated at about 82 per 1,000 births. And again, in 2001, and I know these statistics are old, the 2002 and the 2001. In 2001, 10.4 million children died before they reached the age of 5. And again, the highest mortality rates were in sub-Saharan Africa. So you can see we went from 10.4 million in 2001 to now we're at 7.5 million. So it's definitely gone down. It has not gone down enough in 20 years. I mean, it really hasn't if you really think about this. One of the big ways that people did research on looking at how we look at, subjective health behavior is we had to look at the International Body Project. And what the International Body Project was it examined 26 countries from 10 different world regions. They surveyed 7,500 people. And what they did was they rated body figures, what they believed was their body type, and then what they believed their ideal body type should be. And then they measured the disparity to get an indicator of how dissatisfied people were in any given culture. Now, what was found was North and South American women have the most dissatisfaction with their bodies, so the highest levels. They also found that higher affluence meant that more likely people were dissatisfied with their bodies. And this really had a lot to do with the advertisements. So there were more advertisements for specific kind of bodies and more offering means to be able to get those kind of bodies. But what was found was only people with resources are able to achieve that. They also found that the U.S. has some of the highest rates of obesity and yet it is one of the wealthier countries. It had the highest rate of obesity of all of the wealthier countries. And in the United States, 1 in every 6 children and adolescents in the United States between the ages of 2 and 19 were considered obese. And they found that this was probably related to an intake of fast food and sedentary lifestyles. A third of American children were found to eat at least one meal from fast food a day. Now let's get into a couple of diseases. We're just going to look at 2 or 3 here. But what we need to look at first is sexually transmitted diseases and HIV/AIDS. Now, HIV/AIDS used to be a worldwide concern. It was basically a pandemic at one point in time. It is still considered an epidemic, and it has stimulated a lot of research by cross-cultural psychologists on sexual and reproductive health and health education because of the fact that we cannot get the numbers down in some countries. And what is believed is that we really just can't get the education to them to explain how it is spread. Now, in 2007, around 33 million people were living with HIV/AIDS. About 2.7 million people had become newly infected with the virus. Now, since the 1980s, when the disease became known, about 25 million people have died from it. With those numbers, we have seen a decline. The epidemic is declining in some countries, but in some countries it is still thriving. It's been found that 90% of HIV-infected people live in developing countries. Now, with sexually transmitted diseases, because it is spread in a very similar way as HIV/AIDS, while there's been a drop in sexually transmitted diseases that was noted in the mid-1980s, which had a lot to do with the AIDS epidemic, since 1995, basically when a handle was gotten on the HIV/AIDS epidemic, there's now been a gradual and sustained overall increase of about 57%. One other disease that usually doesn't get talked about, especially here in the United States, because we don't see it, we don't have to deal with it, is malaria. Malaria is transmitted by a parasite called Plasmodium, and there's 4 kinds of Plasmodium. The seriousness of the sickness is going to depend on the type of Plasmodium with which one is infected. Now, this parasite of Plasmodium requires mosquitoes as a host, and the mosquitoes require stagnant water as a breeding environment. So if they don't have the stagnant water, they don't breed. If they don't breed, there's no way for the parasite of Plasmodium to get into the mosquitoes. Therefore, they don't bite. We don't get malaria. However, there's so many parts of the world that do have this stagnant water and this heat that results in the breeding of the mosquitoes and then the parasite requiring the mosquitoes as a host, that nearly half of the world's population, from over 90 countries, half of the world's population lives with the risk of malaria. But because it doesn't affect us here, we don't hear about it. But half of the world's population, it's estimated that annually there are between 300 million and 500 million clinical cases of malaria. So annually, think about this in terms of the United States, annually, every single person in the United States gets malaria every year. And about 1.3 million deaths result from malaria, the majority of them in developing countries. But 300 million and 500 million clinical cases. I mean, that's absolutely insane to really think about those numbers, which is why I felt that it needed to be included. So we've talked about health. We've talked about the health models. Now it's time to talk about our diagnostic categories and our mental health disorders. So there are a lot of cross-cultural comparisons in terms of the categories in which we diagnose different mental health disorders. Now, the main issue that we see is the reliability and the validity of these diagnoses. And what happens is because we don't use the same manuals in different countries. So here in the United States, we use the DSM. It's the American Psychiatric Association's Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. Currently, we're at the DSM-5, and it's been revised and edited 5 times now to include or remove certain disorders in the manual. And it's our main system of classification of psychological disorders here in the United States. However, outside of the United States, the DSM is not used. Instead, ICD-10, which is the International Statistical Classification of Disease and Related Health Problems, is what's used commonly around the world, which is why I introduced the chapter by talking about different health issues. Now, the ICD, this is a detailed description of known diseases, known injuries, and it's published by the World Health Organization, which is a branch of the United Nations. Now, there are specific manuals that specific cultures have, very similar to the DSM. So examples, there's the CCMD. This is the Chinese classification tool. Now, local manuals that different cultures have won't necessarily include certain diagnoses from the DSM. Think of certain forms of addiction. And especially if the ratings of the diagnosis are low, or if that culture does not consider it a disorder. So what happens is there's culture-bound disorders, and these are included in cultural diagnostic tools that are not in the US DSM because people of the US don't have these syndromes, just like other classification tools in other cultures don't have some of the disorders that are listed in the DSM. Now, the DSM once had a culture-bound disorders that were common in other places, but not necessarily in the US, that were in the back of the manual. I'm honestly not sure. I'll be real honest. I'm not sure. I haven't looked at the DSM in a little bit to see if it's in 5. I know it was in 4. I'm not sure if the cultural disorders made the jump to 5 or not. Now, when we talk about both of these, the ICD-10, the DSM-5, these are both attempts at theoretical manuals. So what happens is they do this because being theoretically neutral then makes it sound judicious. Both manuals come from the perspective of the biomedical model, and they include people of all different theoretical perspectives when they put this together. The DSM, though, it lingers at mostly levels of symptoms. It doesn't really delve deeper into that theoretical, which is still controversial. But it is less so than if you add the etiology or the epidemiology of the actual disorder. Now, both manuals are starting to lump things together in spectrum disorders and subtypes. So one of the big ones in the DSM was the autism spectrum. It's called autism spectrum disorder, as opposed to having different types of autism. So Asperger's, which is what people used to be diagnosed with when you were on the very, very mild end. It's now just considered the mild end of the autism spectrum. Diagnostic rates are going to differ depending on which manual is used, and the diagnoses are sometimes doubled when using the ICD in some countries. So we have to look at how does culture play a part in psychopathology? Well, first we have to talk about different mental health disorders. What are mental disorders? So it's a syndrome characterized by clinically significant disturbances in an individual's cognition, their emotion regulation, or their behavior that then reflects a dysfunction in the psychological, the biological, or the developmental processes that are underlying our mental functioning. So mental disorders are usually going to be associated with significant distress or significant disability in social, occupational, or even other important activities. And then culture can also affect psychological disorders in at least 5 different areas. So the first we're going to see is subjective experience. This is where we include knowledge of the psychological problems. Obviously, in some areas, they're not going to have subjective experience because they don't have knowledge of that specific mental disorder. The second area, is going to be culture-based idioms of distress. So basically the way an individual explains and expresses their symptoms according to their culture-based display rules. The third area is going to be a culture-based diagnoses. And this is going to be for various forms of psychological disorders because depending upon what manual you're using is going to be dependent upon what diagnoses you use. Then there's going to be culture-based treatment. This is the way that people, including professionals, are going to attempt to basically overcome the psychopathological symptoms. And then the fifth area is going to be the outcome, the culture-based outcome or the principles, according to where the results of treatment are evaluated. Now, what's going to happen is we're going to have 2 different discourses, which are going to have 2 different alternative hypotheses when we talk about any of these 5 areas of psychological disorder in cultures. The first is going to be a relativistic perspective. So here we're going to see humans that develop ideas that are going to be based on a set of cultural prescriptions. So it's going to be our view of psychological disorders according to our culture, basically. The second is going to be a universalistic or an absolutist perspective, which is where, despite cultural differences, we're going to see a great number of similar features, including attitudes, values, behavioral responses. And that's how we're going to view psychological disorders. So really think about this. Which view, relativistic or absolutist, is going to describe a psychological reality with greater accuracy? Well, we have to look at the major features. We have to look at different symptoms. And our major features should be considered universal, but they can manifest as both. So we can see them manifest as a central symptom, which is a symptom of a mental disorder that's going to be observed in practically all cultures. Or there's going to be peripheral symptoms. These are going to be the symptoms of mental disorders that are going to be culture specific. So here, this is figure 9.1 in your book. You can see the difference here. Let me bring up my cursor between absolutist and relativistic. And you can see how there's going to be a continuum between the two. And they can be integrative, where we can have both. And what it's going to lead to is it's going to lead to that mental health disorder, for example, depression. Down here, you're going to see your central symptoms, you're going to see your peripheral symptoms. So central symptoms, these are going to be universalistic. These are going to happen in everybody. Peripheral symptoms, These are going to be symptoms that we're only going to see in a culture-specific mental disorder. So, speaking of culture-specific, that leads us into cultural syndromes. So, with cultural syndromes, these are going to comprise of a set of psychological phenomena of particular interest to psychologists. So again, our DSM-5 is going to define cultural syndromes more as a cluster of symptoms and attributions that are going to tend to co-occur among individuals in specific cultural groups, communities, or contexts. And they're going to be more recognized locally as kind of coherent patterns of experience. Now, cultural syndromes, they're not going to have a one-to-one correspondence with disorders that are recognized by mainstream systems, but they are going to have a lot of overlap and a lot of similarity between the two. And this is where you're going to be looking at your activity this week. There's also going to be at least 7 broad categories that can be differentiated among the phenomenon, and this is often described as those cultural syndromes. So make sure that you read Table 9.1 in your book thoroughly. Now, let's get into a couple of disorders that we tend to see kind of as a universalistic disorder. So the first that we're going to have is anxiety disorders. So our definition of an anxiety disorder is always going to be subject to the interpretation that's rooted in value judgments that may vary across cultures. But for the purpose of this lecture, anxiety disorders is a category of mental disorders that's characterized by persistent anxiety or fears. Now, no matter where the person lives, each anxiety disorder can manifest itself as a set of central symptoms that can be observed in practically every culture, as well as in a set of peripheral symptoms that are going to be very culture specific. Now, an example of this, in Japan or Korea, individuals with social phobia may express persistent fear of actually being offensive to others, as opposed to a fear of being in a social situation. They actually fear that fear of being in a social situation is going to offend somebody, and that fear takes over. In some Middle Eastern countries, they restrict the participation of women in public life, and there are strict rules that are applied to women's clothes and their behavior in public places. And I apologize, that is my dog coughing in the background. So with these strict rules that apply to women's clothes, their behavior in public places, a woman's reluctance to then appear in public should not be automatically considered by a United States professional as agoraphobia. With depressive disorders, so the very first scientific account of depressive disorders were associated with the works of Greek scholars, physicians, philosophers, and they shared several common views on human emotion, and a lot of this was categorized as hysteria, if you remember that. So with depressive disorders, this is a category of psychological disorders that are characterized by a profound and persistent feeling of sadness, despair, guilt, loss of interest in things that were once pleasurable, and disturbance in sleep and appetite. And at least 3 factors together influence the content of the clinical picture of mood disorders around the world. And that's going to be our diagnostic practices, our understanding of symptoms by the individual, and then the disclosure of the symptoms. Finally, we have schizophrenia. Schizophrenia is going to be a disorder that's going to be categorized by the presence of delusions, hallucinations, disorganized speech, or disorganized or catatonic behavior. Now, approximately 1% of the world's population today is affected by schizophrenia, and the symptoms do appear to be universal. However, despite the assumed biological causes, it has been found that there are social conditions that can and do affect the course of schizophrenia. So an example of this is that people may internalize their environmental influences differently, such as peer pressure, requirements, expectations from others. Schizophrenia has been found to be more common in men than in women in most parts of the world, but it's actually reversed in China, where schizophrenia is more common in women than in men. This is one thing where we're going to see a culture specific towards a syndrome. We also have to talk about culture and suicide. Now, in the United States, we see that approximately every 15 minutes, somebody in the United States commits suicide and takes his or her life. In countries such as Germany, Taiwan, and the US, suicide rates are much higher than we see in less economically advanced countries. So, an example, the ratio of suicide between the United States and India is approximately 2-1. Japan has even higher rates of suicide than the United States, especially among the elderly. Muslim countries that are unaffected by war have had traditionally low suicide rates. And overall, suicide levels are lower in less developed countries, particularly African, Asian, and Latin American countries, as well as Islamic nations. So it just kind of shows, again, how that culture plays a part in how people are affected in terms of mental health disorders. We also have to look at personality disorders. So when we look at personality disorders, these are going to be enduring patterns of behavior and inner experience that's going to deviate markedly from the expectations of an individual's culture. And I'm so sorry about my dog. She has something caught in her throat. I do apologize. Professionals in many nations are going to recognize personality disorders as a special diagnostic category. And the DSM notes that judgments about appropriate and inappropriate traits is going to vary across cultures. So make sure that you guys read Table 9.3 in your book. And I did put them here in the slides so you can see the first is going to be our cluster A of personality disorders. This is going to be our odd and our eccentric behavior. Slide 27 is going to be our cluster B, our very dramatic, emotional, or erratic behaviors. And then slide 28 is going to be our cluster C, our anxious and our fearful behaviors. So one last topic is substance abuse, culturally bound. So when we talk about substance abuse, there are going to be cultural and national standards for both substance use and substance abuse. So in an effort to use more neutral terminology, the DSM-5 actually avoids the terms abuse and addiction because of their uncertain definitions and the potentially negative connotations, and instead uses disorder. So substance use disorder is a cluster of cognitive, behavioral, and physiological symptoms that indicate that the individual continues using the substance despite significant substance-related problems. So some examples of this. Marijuana is outlawed outlawed in a lot of United States, but it's completely legal under certain conditions in Holland. The legal drinking age in the United States is 21. In contemporary Russia, it's only 18. And laws against selling alcohol to minors are not strictly enforced. Also, think about in some European countries, France and Italy. You're able to have a drink as long as a parent is in the presence. And then in most Asian countries, except Korea, the overall prevalence of alcohol-related disorders is actually really low. And this was found because 50% of Korean, Japanese, and Chinese individuals actually lack a particular chemical in their blood called aldehyde dehydrogenase that eliminates the first breakdown product of alcohol. And what happens is when such individuals consume alcohol, they experience a flushed face and palpitations, very similar to an allergic reaction. So this is just an overview. It's our last slide of just some ethnic anomalies that have been found. So African Americans have a higher prevalence of schizophrenia and mood disorders. Puerto Ricans have higher rates of mental illness than many other Latin cultures. So Americans that are born have higher rates than those in Puerto Rico. Asian Americans have been found to have the lowest 12-month prevalence for major depression, anxiety disorder, panic disorder, and mania. Chinese women are more likely to report depression than Vietnamese women. Filipino men are more likely to report substance abuse than Chinese men. Foreign-born people are less likely to have anxiety, depression, or substance abuse than United States-born people. Refugees have higher rates of PTSD, depression, and anxiety, even after 2 years of being in the United States. And immigrants are less likely to engage in any type of deviant behavior or have a personality disorder. I hope you enjoyed this chapter. I do apologize again about my dog. Please reach out if you have any questions.